Hi, I'm Katie Briggs, and I'm a senior product designer at NPR. Some of my recent work there includes rethinking how we can use our digital platforms to drive value to member stations and working on NPR's mobile strategy. I also conduct a lot of user research on everything from voice assistants to mobile platforms to digital donations. For the next 30 minutes, we're going to be discussing how you can take the idea of user research and actually apply it to your projects, especially if there are obstacles that have prevented you from doing so in the past. And so, what does it mean when we talk about research? There are lots of methodologies and approaches that can fall under the category of research, but ultimately they all hinge on three key activities: forming questions, gathering data, and analyzing and sharing what you found. So, let's think about this question. Who, when you think about your next round of user research, doesn't foresee any obstacles to conducting that research? Probably isn't a sentiment that very many of us can identify with, right? We can all think of things that might go wrong or challenges we might run into along the way when we think about talking to our users. And there are a lot of things that can get in the way when you want to conduct research, especially if that research is new to your team or if you're experimenting with something that's potentially risky. It can feel like there are a lot of insurmountable obstacles. So these are the four biggest themes that seem to crop up in opposition to doing research: expertise in analytics, people power, money, and time. So let's break those down for a moment. Starting with expertise in analytics. So why would we even spend time doing user research? We work with teams of brilliant people that have combined decades of experience and expertise. So why would we jump through the hoops of user research when we probably have a good sense of what audiences want? And when we think about digital products, we have so much data on those platforms. So why do we need research when we have metrics? Well, that doesn't mean we need to throw out all of our prior knowledge or quantitative data. Those can actually help us inform the work that we do. They're certainly good for helping us to avoid repeating past mistakes. They can help us find patterns in existing projects, and they can help build context for generating assumptions, which we'll talk more about shortly. But prior knowledge and quantitative data aren't good for everything. They can't help you understand your users' wants and needs. They will not be helpful in uncovering new possibilities and opportunities. And ultimately, they won't help our organizations make impactful decisions. And so everybody is familiar with this quote, right? Allegedly, Henry Ford said this about asking users what they wanted, although if he actually said this is debatable. If I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Well, you can apply this very idea that has been kind of in the way of user research to your colleagues' expertise. So if we don't talk to users about their behaviors and expectations, and we only rely on what we think we know, we're going to end up with some pretty wonky solutions. If we only relied on analytics and prior expertise to make something better than, say, the typical horse, this is what we might hear. I once rode a horse and it was kind of slow. Our competition announced their horse speed department last quarter. Analytics show the average time on horses 20 minutes. Right? None of these things help us get to something that's truly innovative. None of these ideas get us to a car. So if we don't get out in the field and start to really poke at the core of what people want, we're never going to get to a truly innovative solution that will solve our problem. So Michael Beirut, a partner at the legendary Pentagram Design, has said, we tend to be distracted by the voices in our own head telling us what the design should look like. And that's true when it comes to what we think we know, right? The voices in our head, led by our own biases and expertise, can get in the way of our best audience serving work. So you can quiet those voices with this quote: your opinion, while interesting, is irrelevant. Opinions are great, and the hunches and viewpoints that we hold help guide us through life. But in user research, we need to let our processes work and keep our opinions and biases out of the way. So next, let's look at people power. So who feels like they can relate to this cat? I feel like, especially in the world that we're living in now, where most of us are working from home, many of us working from home with people that we have to take care of, we always have a lot going on. And that's also true of our colleagues and other people we may be working with. So another common research obstacle is people, specifically finding people who are interested in and willing to collaborate with you. Because everybody is really busy, and research definitely takes a lot of time. But the task of conducting research can feel like less of a burden if those tasks are shared. And so we know why it's hard to work together. Folks' egos and silos in our organizations prevent us from collaborating efficiently. People are jockeying for resources and value, and if they work with you on your project, then their project might not get what it needs to succeed. It's a real fear. A lot of times, research is also seen as something that's done by a separate person or group and then handed off. A lot of times, people are used to waiting for results to research instead of working on it themselves. And so let's think about this question for a moment. Think about, in the organization you work in today, how easy is it to collaborate? Is it pretty simple? Does everyone just work together easily and collaboration is kind of a breeze? Or is it really tough and everyone just kind of wants to pull their own weight and keep their heads down? Probably for most of us, we land somewhere in the middle of that scale, but it's important to think about collaboration in the context of your organization for the rest of this conversation. So let's say that you work at a place where collaboration maybe is not the easiest thing to do. How can we get more people on board to collaborate around research? Well, projects are less work for individuals if there are more people pulling their weight. And ultimately, everyone wants the same goal, to better understand something that we have a question about. And so take some time to recognize as a team that research, if you approach it all together, is going to be a change from your regular workflow. People will have different roles. Your day-to-day tasks will change for a while. There will be periods of ambiguity that may be uncomfortable until you reach the end of your study. But a good way to get people excited in research is to start what I call a collaboration pyramid scheme. So get just two people excited about collaborating and then have them get two colleagues excited about it, and so on and so forth. It doesn't take too long for a coalition of people who are excited or at least curious about collaborating on research to form. And that can be really, really powerful as you start to grow your team of people who might be willing to collaborate. But of course, it's important to address the really hard thing about collaboration, that it can't exist without conflict. And that's why it's important to understand and embrace that conflict is a natural part of any research process, and that is uncomfortable for everybody. And the discomfort that you or your colleagues may feel at different points of the research process is truly just part of the process. So don't be afraid to address it respectfully, but address it head on so that all of you can move forward together. And so, as we think about collaborating around research, here are four key things to remember. First, if collaboration starts to feel a little heated, that's okay. Remember that there's no collaboration without conflict. Next, cut down on some of the discomfort by determining a shared goal and make that goal as specific as you can. Third, define clear roles. So when you think about research and you have a team of folks who are willing to help you, not everyone needs to be a moderator. You can use note takers, observers, schedulers, writers, recruiters, project managers. There are so many different roles that people can take on in the research process, and those roles also vary in responsibility and commitment, so there should be something that's a good fit for most people. And remember to keep your own convictions, which kind of loops back to conflict, right? Because sometimes people have convictions that will clash. If you feel strongly about something, say it and press for it. But try and get those convictions worked out early in the process so that you can do your research with your audience, knowing that everything has been ironed out beforehand. So just remember that collaboration requires intent. You need to buy into a collaborative mindset before you can get your colleagues to do it. So make a change and then start to evangelize to your coworkers. Okay, so our third obstacle we want to talk about is money. We'll definitely dig into more ways to save money on the side of implementing this framework. But first, just at a high level, we all know how this goes. It seems like there is never enough money to fund what we're trying to accomplish. But if you think about it, how much money will go into the type of project you're ultimately trying to build? Is it hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars? If your organization has the money to spend on a project, then they have the money to make sure that that thing is the right thing. It's just good business. Why would you invest tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars or maybe even millions of dollars into something that didn't have any research? You wouldn't buy a car without research. You wouldn't buy a house without getting it inspected. So why would you spend a ton of your organization's money on a project that hasn't been vetted? Erica Hall says it best here. If you have money to do a thing, you have money to make sure it's the right thing. Just keep that in mind. And finally, time. You can really apply the same principle here that you applied to money. There are so many hours in a day, but there's no limit to the number of things that can live in your backlog. So it's definitely easy to say that there's no time for research because the project needs to get out the door. But again, if you have time to do a thing, you have time to make sure to do the research to make sure it's the right way to go. You might have barely enough time to do research, but you definitely don't have time to do an entire thing over again when something doesn't work because it wasn't vetted with research before it went out the door. So we've gone over these 4 barriers. And for the rest of the session, I'd like to focus on the final 2, which I know are obstacles that we run up against a lot, regardless of organization size or budget. It just always seems like, we're a little strapped for money and or time. And here are some ways we can maybe get around that obstacle, those 2 obstacles. So the majority of my career has been in public media. And that means that we are running on a nonprofit budget and things are always pretty tight. But I also love to be efficient, right? And so when I thought about my background in public media and my love of efficiency, I really was trying to find ways when it came to research to save time and money. And that led me to develop something new, a super rapid user research framework. And so I took those 3 main activities of research, forming questions, gathering data, and sharing and analyzing that data, and stripped our process to the bare minimum. And so the framework aims to answer this question: how might we conduct high quality research with significantly little time or effort? Of course, there are other approaches to user research that might save you time and money. For instance, guerrilla testing at a Starbucks or using online services that get you feedback from random professional testers in a short amount of time. But those approaches won't get you the high value feedback that you can get from your real users. The super rapid user research framework gets your ideas in front of real users, but without the time and resources that are often seen as barriers to getting a project done quickly and cheaply. So let's walk through some of the ways this framework makes user research easier, starting with timelines. So if you let it, user research can take weeks to complete. Every single step of the process has the potential to expand. And when you're working on a project that's time sensitive, removing research from the equation may be like a good way to save some time. So I condensed research into a Friday to Friday timeline. All of the key activities to research are here, but they're conducted over the course of a little over a week. This makes sure that you're cutting the fat that is often added to research projects, but it also it presses you to move forward. So as you go from one day to another, there's always something else that you can knock out off your list. Another common challenge when you're starting to do research is defining exactly what you want to dig into. So what questions do you want to answer? Which thread do you want to unravel? Generating assumptions as a team is a great way to start to define the purpose of your research. And so let's talk about assumption generation. Assumptions help you paint a picture of what you're trying to find out from testing by defining the reality of your product as you see it. So as a brainstorming exercise, you and your team, your collaborators, your coworkers, will write assumptions to explain what you think is true. They can be questions or statements, and they're typically easier to write from the user's point of view. Assumptions can be based on facts, but they don't have to be. At this point, you don't need to worry about anything being truly correct. You just need to write out your perceptions that you want to poke at in testing. So here are some potential prompts you might use to come up with assumptions. And there are a lot of questions for one person to answer here, and you probably don't have the answers or the perspective you need to answer all of them. This is why you need people to collaborate with you and jump in and dig into some of these other questions that maybe you don't really have the know-how to answer on your own. If you want to really funnel your assumption generation prompts down, I encourage you to just start with these 2 big questions. What do we care about for this study, or for this research? And what don't we care about? It's a really easy way to start that conversation. And so here's how collaborative assumption generation works. First, we use Post-its and Sharpies. Assumptions should be brief, and these tools will help you keep them that way. 1 sticky note per assumption or hunch. Next, have all the individuals on your team take about 7 to 10 minutes to write down their assumptions. Then, cluster those sticky notes based on similarities or common themes. Label those clusters, and you'll have a sense of what questions, hunches, and assumptions you should be addressing with your research. I'm sorry, my son just woke up from a nap, and I think you can probably hear him from upstairs. So I'm going to text my husband and ask him if he can help keep it down. But because I'm recording, I'm just going to send a text very briefly. Okay. The joys of working from home. Okay, so we have talked about what happens with collaborative generation, assumption generation. Uh, so we'll have everyone write down their assumptions on Post-it notes and then cluster them on a wall, or if you're working remotely, which obviously we all are currently, or most of us are currently, you can do this using great tools like Miro or Mural to get basically the same thing. You know, use digital Post-it notes to do the same kind of brainstorming and clustering that you would be doing on Post-it notes when you're all working together in one place. Okay, so another way to cut down on using resources during your research is by making sure that you're using the right methodology or activity to conduct your research. So making sure that you're starting off on the right path. So now that we know what we want to learn by figuring that out and defining that, and we've outlined our assumptions with collaborative assumption generation, we can decide how we want to go about our research. And first, we should pick a goal. And that's going to help us decide which research method we should go with. So the question here is, what do we want to do? Do we want to discover, explore, test, or listen? Let's talk about what each of these does. Discovery is great if you want to find allies or to talk with experts or involve your stakeholders. You can also use discovery for finding data sources or determining which metrics to track. You may be interested in exploration if you want to design with accessibility in mind, give users control, prevent errors, improve messaging, check for inconsistencies, consider bad or facetious user cases, and get feedback on a fledgling concept. We end up doing quite a bit of exploration at NPR because we're so curious and kind of these early ideas that we have. If you just want to test, you're probably interested in tracking usability bugs, creating training materials, including diverse users, and tracking usability over time. And finally, if your goal is to listen, listening will give you an opportunity to pay attention to user sentiment and to recruit people for further research. So once you've kind of chosen a goal between discover, explore, test, or listen, we can choose a method. And so each goal, as you'll see here, has lots of different methods associated with it. And some are more common in certain industries or on certain platforms than others. Some of my favorites and some of the ones that we use most often at NPR include user interviews, diary studies, prototype testing, feedback review, and design review. But there are lots of other good examples here. So when you think about what a user research session might look like, you might imagine a room full of participants talking about a product while stakeholders watch through two-way glass. Very Mad Men, right? But for a number of reasons, focus groups are rarely the right approach for research. In fact, there's no methodology that is truly one size fits all. So instead, we can think about the right methodology after thinking through our goals, key questions, assumptions, and resources that we have available. Some things are just going to be better fits for certain projects and teams than others. We can also use this matrix to choose a research approach. So depending on if you're more interested in learning about user behaviors or attitudes, and if you prefer direct or indirect interaction with your participants, you can narrow your list of possible research methods. As a reminder, behaviors, which is at the top of this matrix, means what people do. Attitudes, down at the bottom of this matrix, are what people say. Those two things are often not the same. People may be doing one thing and saying that they do something else. And so these are just a few commonly used research methodologies then plotted on this matrix to give you a sense of how this works. And so there are numerous approaches to do research, but there will only be one or two that are the right fit to answer the questions that you're hoping to answer. Another way to save time and money is to make sure that you're talking to the right people. And that all comes down to recruiting and screening participants that best suit your needs, and then scheduling the appropriate amount of time to talk to them. So in real life, the task of recruiting participants is super time consuming, or at least it can be, because getting your message out to the right people and getting enough folks to qualify after completing a screener is a lot of work. But we need to do the legwork so that we have the right people signed up for research. And doing that legwork includes these 3 steps: defining your audience, so considering what you want to find out, who you want to talk to, and again, who don't you want to talk to, so thinking about both what you want and what you don't want. Then meeting them where you know that they are. So do studies need to be in person? If we've learned anything for the last few months, it's that no, most research does not need to be done in person. Like, it can be done over Zoom or it can be done over a phone call. Try and meet them where they are. It's a lot easier to recruit people when they don't have to make their way toward your office, if they don't need to have video turned on, if they have things happening in the background behind them. Just really try and make things as easy for the participant as possible. And finally, consider rewards. Because participating in research takes time and effort, you want to be sure to compensate folks for that. And so finding a reward that is reasonable for the amount of work they're doing is really important as you kind of start to build this relationship with participants. And so then after you recruit participants, you'll want to screen those people, putting constraints into practice to make sure your potential participants match who you're looking for. So consider, again, who you want and you don't want to participate, what kind of information is important to you regarding this study, and how can you use the screener to build a pool of future participants. So the screenshot you'll see on the right side of your screen is just a screenshot of a Google form that probably looks pretty familiar to folks that we use to screen potential participants at NPR. And so you'll see that the question there is, what types of digital devices do you use? If we're doing a study that's only relevant on an iPhone, we don't want to just completely disqualify participants who have an Android phone forever. We just want to disqualify them from this single study, but we keep all those participants in a pool, so the next time we do need Android users, we have a nice little batch of them already available instead of having to do a recruit completely from scratch. And so once you have a good set of participants through your screener, you can schedule those sessions. I recommend using Calendly so you can specify when you're available and have participants fill in those slots. In addition to considering how long each session will last, be mindful of how much time you'll need to prep for each session and to recover afterward. Research is hard work, and your brain is going to need some breathing room between those sessions. I would not recommend going back to back to back to back if you can help it at all. Okay, so now we're to the fun stuff. Let's talk about prototyping. What are you going to have users test out, and how much time and effort will it take to build? And I have an asterisk here because there is certainly a chance that maybe you don't need a prototype. A lot of quality research can happen just by talking to real users or by observing how they interact with other experiences or products. It's certainly good research to look at how people are interacting with your competitors' apps or products, right? It doesn't always have to be something new that you've built. But if you do need a prototype, you can use this chart to figure out how complex and at which fidelity your prototype should be. And so you can see you have kind of the stages of your project listed, as well as the levels of fidelity. Other things you might be wondering about include how easy it might be to revise the prototype, or what the primary focus of your research is at this point. This hopefully will kind of help you get settled on, about what your prototype should look and feel like. But sometimes you'll have a project that is tough to prototype at all. An example of this, I was asked to prototype an interactive audio quiz on Alexa, but the project was so top secret that the prototype couldn't be shared on third-party software, and it had to be done completely in 2 weeks. Yeah, it's not very much time to put a prototype together, especially if it's something that is very new and experimental. So after thinking about it quite a bit and tinkering around at different places, this is the prototype we used. And prototype is a pretty techy word because all kinds of things can be prototypes. It doesn't need to be complicated, and it doesn't need to involve code to achieve what you need it to. And so this is essentially a soundboard that plays a different audio clip depending on which button you push. And so when you're moderating the tests, you'd have this pulled up on a laptop. And when the user does the test, this would have been in person at the time the study was in person, you would push the buttons at the appropriate times, depending on what the user says, and the audio would play on a smart speaker that had been connected to your laptop via Bluetooth. So already starting to kind of string things together with metaphorical duct tape. So to you, to the person who's moderating the study, this would be a manual activity, but to the user, it appears as if they're actually interacting with the speaker and playing the game. And so when I built this tool at NPR, I made it in PowerPoint. And by nature, I'm a visual person. My job is to be a product designer. And so it hurts to say that I made this kind of clunky looking thing in PowerPoint. That was the software that I used. But the prototype worked like a charm. And it was really fine that the prototype was totally ugly because it totally worked. Okay, so let's talk about reports now. If you let it, creating a research findings report can take truly weeks. I'm a very slow writer, so sometimes it takes me a really long time because you just conducted an insightful study and there's so much you've learned and what you want to share with your colleagues But with this framework, we're trying to save time. And so a great way to do that is to allocate a set amount of time to write your findings report. I recommend a time box of 1 day. So 8 hours of writing, and that is it. And so what goes into a findings report? What is it like? Well, there are a lot of elements that could go into a findings report. I'm sure you could think of, kind of an outline of quite a few. But the answer to this question is really not as finite list as much as just whatever your stakeholders and teammates need. So just think about what those folks need to understand your findings and move forward. What do we learn? What are the implications? What are our next steps? And that's probably all you need to really include. It doesn't need to be too terribly detailed. A findings report needs to include key findings. That's kind of the obvious biggie. Were there any patterns discovered during these tests? Was there anything that was made clear or any new questions that arose as testing was underway? What themes appeared across sessions? You could also include other things, though, if you find it relevant for your team, including methodology, how do we do this test, participants, who did they talk to and what did they say, implications, what do these findings mean for the assumptions and questions we wanted to test, and recommendations. What do we do now that we've found all of this out? The last step then, once you have your report put together, is to distribute these findings to other stakeholders and interested parties. Keep in mind that any research that's done is only one factor in a list of considerations when it comes to making a decision. User research is rarely the only reason for a final decision, but it is absolutely vital to the process of getting to one. And so you can turn your research process into a lean machine. Just remember to keep these activities in mind, and you can decide what needs to be pared away for you and your team's needs. Thank you. Looking forward to answering all your questions, and please send me an email or follow me on Twitter and send me a message if you have more questions or ideas. Thank you so much.